You guys can hear me, right? Everyone? I haven't turned on the video, so don't worry about that. Turn it on in a minute, inshallah. You guys can hear me, right? Everyone? Okay, good. Plants all over my windowsill. Someone's decided that I get a lot of sunshine on this windowsill. That's better, steady lighting. Okay. Okay. One more thing. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. So, brothers and sisters, welcome. You can hear me better, right? Move the mic next to me, inshallah. Sound is better? Should be. Good. All right. So, just going to go straight into some new paragraphs. We've got some great things to discuss today, inshallah ta'ala. So, let's go. So, al-muhasibi says, I'll read the next lines first. So he says, وَلَا تَذْكُرْ أَحَدًا بِغِيبَةٍ وَسُدَّ عَلَى نَفْسِكَ بَابَ سُوءِ الظَّنِّ بِخَوْفِ الْمَسْأَلَةِ وَافْتَحْ بَابَ حُسْنِ الظَّنِّ بِسَعَةِ التَّأْوِيلِ وَأَغْلِقْ بَابَ الطَّمَعِ بِالْإِيَاسِ واستفتح باب الغنى بالقناعة ونزه ذكر الله تعالى عن إضافة المكاره وحصل الأوقات واعرف ما يذهب به ليلك ونهارك. I'll stop there, inshallah, because we'll probably get through the whole session with that. So, So al-muhasibi says, and do not mention anyone by way of backbiting. لا تذكر أحدا بغيبة. Do not mention anyone in a backbiting way. So obviously we always mention people, we always mention each other, we always talk about one another. But a specifically prohibited way to mention one another is ghiba, which most people know, but as way of reminder, I'll quickly run over it again, inshallah ta'ala. وَسُدَّ عَلَى نَفْسِكَ بَابَ سُوءِ الظَّنِّ بِخَوْفِ الْمَسْأَلَةِ, and close off for yourself or for your soul, for your nafs, the door of suspicious of opinions or having a bad opinion of another, by being fearful of being questioned about it on the Day of Judgment. Meaning, consider the fact that you will be questioned on the Day of Judgment with regards to having bad opinions of other people, and with that in mind, bring yourself to close that door. So he's reminding us basically that negative thoughts about unjustified negative thoughts about people are not just thoughts, but they are things that we can be accountable for before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he says, وَافْتَحْ بَابَ حُسْنِ الظَّنِّ بِسَعَةِ التَّأْوِيلِ, and open up the door of, so close the door of having bad opinions, and open up the door of having good opinions by way of broad interpretation, or by way of generous interpretation. And what he means by that is that when you see something of someone that could be interpreted negatively and positively, or even interpreted negatively, as in you could have a bad opinion because you think what they're doing is suspicious, open up the door of good opinions by relying on interpretation. So engage in positive interpretations of the actions and words of people in order to avoid being suspicious. وَأَغْلِقْ بَابَ الطَّمَعِ وَالْإِيَاسِ, and close the door of wishful thinking by way of despair. This is with reference to people and people's possessions. So close the door of wishful thinking about people and what people can do for you and what you can get out of people, etc., by despairing of what they have, so that you're a more independent person. You're more somebody who focuses on their reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as opposed to their reliance on people. Somebody who relies on Allah and then relies on what they themselves are capable of. And it's also a way of building confidence in oneself and self-belief and so on through belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Might touch on that a bit more, inshallah. And وَاسْتَفْتِحْ بَابَ الْغِنَى بِالْقَنَاعَةِ, and open up for yourself, or seek to open up the door of wealth, of independence, or the feeling of independence, or the feeling of richness by way of contentment. Meaning that the way you pursue a state of wealth and a state of being rich is by pursuing contentment rather than material wealth. Material wealth, people may or may not get. You may pursue it and not get it. You may pursue it and get it. But in either scenario, if a person doesn't have contentment, then they are unhappy when they don't have it, but also unhappy when they do have it, because they don't have contentment. So the one who has it, even if it's in the billions, they're not content. So they continue to pursue it, and therefore it never gives them contentment. The one who doesn't have it, so therefore isn't content. So if contentment is the key, then you pursue contentment rather than pursuing material wealth, which is a matter of necessity, maybe of utility, or it has its uses, right? So you might need it for your necessities. It may be another form of strategic utility. It might be necessary for the alleviation of poverty, for the wealth of the state, for being able to change society positively, etc., etc. but ultimately it cannot be about your personal pursuit of material wealth, because if that is without the pursuit of contentment, then you'll never have contentment. And that's why the best way, as my teachers often taught me, the best way to pursue wealth is to pursue it with a service mindset, to pursue wealth for the service of others, and to focus on spending on yourself for your own necessities. That's probably the best way to pursue wealth, and it also partly makes up the mindset of the most successful people in wealth pursuit. They tend to be people who have a bigger project, a bigger vision. It's not just about, I want my first million. I've spoken about this before, but it's really, really important to truly take that on board. Yeah, if you have billions, then you're gonna enjoy a billionaire's lifestyle. But it's often the really, really successful ones weren't necessarily in the pursuit of counting money, but more in the pursuit of some sort of perfection, some sort of excellence, or some sort of vision. And with any kind of success, money follows, right? So does fame, so does celebrity, so do all of those things, which are trappings, which are a danger and have been a danger for many, many people of wealth and power, who having started off with the best of intentions end up becoming corrupted by those things, which is why it's important that that the objective is clear before the pursuit, right? And the objective is the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the service of others, the betterment of society, of the world. But as far as one's personal considerations go, then the thing to pursue as a defensive mechanism against materialism is qana'ah, right? If you can achieve contentment in your soul, then wealth is no more than a afterthought, right? If you have a reason to pursue it, if you have a practical reason to pursue it, you pursue it. But irrespective of the result, you have contentment. وَنَزِّهْ ذِكْرَ اللَّهِ عَنْ إِضَافَةِ الْمَكَارِهِ, and purify the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from associating with Allah any makarih, so anything that is reprehensible, right? Or anything that is, I think probably a more general and easier word is anything that is negative, right? Anything that has negativity associated with it. And I will inshallah elaborate on this a little bit. And then he says, وَحَصِّلِ الْأَوْقَاتِ, and take account or take advantage of your time, and know how you spend your day and your night, or know that which, I mean, his literal translation of what he says is, he says, وَعْرِفْ مَا يَذْهَبُ بِهِ لَيْلُكَ وَنَهَارُكَ, recognize that which takes away, or runs away with, if I want to be like really, really literal, then take that which takes away your night and your day. There's some value in appreciating the literal meaning of those words, actually. مَا يَذْهَبُ بِهِ لَيْلُكَ وَنَهَارُكَ. All right, so that's what I read. So firstly, I'm going to go back. I usually don't have the discipline to translate the whole thing and then elaborate, but today I did. Maybe it's the banana I just ate. So he says, I don't mention anyone by way of backbiting. So as you know, backbiting has been prohibited, most importantly in the Quran. It is something that is haram by qat'i, by absolute proof, because of the fact that its prohibition is in the Quran. Of course, in many ahadith as well. But usually prohibitions that are laid out, that are borne out in the Quran are very, very, very strong. And interestingly enough, quite a few of the things that he mentions having a bad opinion, Allah mentions that in the Quran as well, and so on. Anyway, so with regards to ghiba, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا يَغْتَبْ, in Surah Al-Hujurat, he says, وَلَا يَغْتَبْ بَعْضُكُمْ بَعْضًا أَيُحِبُّ أَحَدُكُمْ أَن يَأْكُلَ لَحْمَ أَخِيهِ مَيْتًا فَكَرِهْتُمُوهُ. So ghiba is illustrated quite graphically in the Quran as something extremely reprehensible. So he says, let none of you backbite the other. وَلَا يَغْتَبْ بَعْضُكُمْ بَعْضًا. Don't backbite one another. أَيُحِبُّ أَحَدُكُمْ. By way of illustration, by way of metaphor, he says, would any of you like to eat their dead brother's flesh? فَكَرِهْتُمُ. You would certainly find that disgusting. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that backbiting another person is as though, meaning its reprehensibility, it's the disgusting nature of it is like eating somebody, your own brother's dead flesh. So if you find that illustration disgusting, then you should know that backbiting is just as disgusting. All right, so it is the verse is meant to create disgust in us towards the act. Of course, sadly, people aren't very disgusted by it. They take great pleasure in it. All right, it's like nowadays backbiting has become something of a tasty dish, sadly. So that's something, for us all to reflect on. Backbiting is a heinous sin, and it is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah Al-Hujurat quite aptly, among a host of other things, such as mockery, making fun of one another, having a bad opinion of another, spying on one another, etc., etc., because of all of which are part of a package of prohibitions that relate to positive social relations, meaning that if we want to have a healthy society, then these are some of the things that we have to avoid. And among them, I often, when I used to make tafsir of that surah, I used to put them in some sort of order. I used to say it starts with something that is innocent, such as taking the mick, joking, mockery, وَلَا تَنَابَزُوا بِالْأَلْقَابِ, calling each other names and so on. In this day and age particularly, it's done almost, it's become part of our language. It's become part of our colloquialism, right? It's muhawara, as we say, right? It's like, it's part and parcel of just speaking. We use nicknames, sometimes offensive ones. But usually people who are dominant in a social clique tend to use offensive nicknames for the others, expecting them to tolerate it because they are the dominant one. So there's an interesting kind of power dynamic that goes on with regards to name calling. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts off by saying, وَلَا تَنَابَزُوا بِالْأَلْقَابِ بِئْسَ الْاسْمُ الْفُسُوقُ بَعْدَ الْإِيمَانِ. And then he indicates that the particularly bad names are the ones that hint at a sin, right? After a person has believed, don't use names that remind them of their sinfulness or of their past. Or we could say today, after a person has made tawbah, don't use a nickname that was used in their jahiliyyah, because it reminds them of their jahiliyyah. بِئْسَ الْاسْمُ الْفُسُوقُ بَعْدَ الْإِيمَانِ. A name of sinfulness, a nickname of sinfulness is evil after a person has come back to, has come into iman. There is, and وَمَنْ لَمْ يَتُبْ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الظَّالِمُونَ. Whoever has not repented, they are the oppressors. This indicates that part of the verse can be used to say and to infer that these are major sins, right? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about he talks about backbiting in the subsequent verses. He talks about spying on one another, backbiting, and he talks about having a bad opinion. So if we were to having bad opinions of one another, so he talks about inna ba'da dhanni ithm, that many an instance of having a bad opinion of another is a sin, right? So I was saying that if you were to sequence those, you could say that innocent banter, it begins with things that have a kind of underlying offense within innocent banter that can trigger and evoke bad opinions of one another. that can then result in speaking ill of the person behind their back, that can trigger spying and prying behavior in order to confirm one's suspicions. And there can be different orders to these things, but essentially these form a kind of dynamic, right, of social ills that result in social breakdown, right? So it's really, really important. These things are they're very dishonorable, by the way, universally. So I think everybody acknowledges that these things are bad. But if generally a society, if a group of people or a society of people don't get on well together, then generally you will find that these things are prevalent, right? These evils are prevalent within them, and they get in the way of brotherhood. They get in the way of the values the Prophet ﷺ tried to instill in Muslim society, the values of mu'akha, of brotherhood, the values of mahabba. He says you will not achieve iman. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a hadith tells us that that you will not achieve iman until you love one another, right? لَن تُؤْمِنُوا حَتَّى تَحَابُوا. You will never, quite strong words, you will never achieve iman until you love one another. And should I guide you to something that if you were to do it, then you would achieve the love of one another? And he said, "Afshu salama bainakum," right? Spread salam to one another, meaning greet one another with salam. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, "Tahadaw tahabbu," give gifts to one another, because it will foster love. We discussed in previous sessions. We discussed the value of mukafa, of if one person does you a favor, then return the favor, of gratitude, as that being a form of gratitude, and so on and so forth. Making dua for somebody, if they do you a favor and you are not unable to return that favor in kind, at least make dua for them. These are all things that we have discussed just previously that make for a positive, loving, brotherly, sisterly Muslim society. These are the things that tear it down. The things we're talking about now are the things that basically tear it down. And you can go on, right? In the last week we talked about help your brother when he's oppressed. If he's an oppressor, then bring him back to the truth. Don't when it comes to giving his or her rights, give it fully. Don't demand your right back fully. Meaning forego your own rights if you can, and if somebody owes you money, then go easy on them when you demand its return. Be gentle with orphans and widows and so on, and be honorable and generous to patient poor people. But and also have a merciful kind of magnanimous approach towards rich people who are also being tried and tested in their own way, and never be jealous of each other. And in the previous week we talked about other good traits kind of that bind society in a very, very strong bond. These are the things that basically tear it down. Ghiba being probably one of the worst ones, because it affirms what were previously, or it spreads what may be completely benign and innocent observations, or what may be completely just empty suspicion, right? Or it could even be malicious intent. It could be somebody that's out trying to do harm, and you're falling for it because you're listening to their backbiting, which is why both backbiting as well as listening to it, participating in it by listening to it, entertaining it as by way of gossip and so on, is haram. Of course, gossip, if it is false, isn't backbiting, right? That's slander. And the Prophet ﷺ was asked about ghiba, and he said, ذِكْرُكَ أَخَاكَ بِمَا يَكْرَهُ. The Prophet ﷺ defined it for us. He said, backbiting is to mention your brother in a manner that he would dislike, right? Meaning, if you say something about somebody that they would dislike. So what's interesting here is that a lot of people, they justify backbiting by saying, I don't care, I'll say it to his face. You guys heard that before? Yeah, I'm sure you have. Maybe even said it. Correct? I want a comment on this, right? You guys heard this before? Who hasn't? Right? Who hasn't? So, ذِكْرُكَ أَخَاكَ بِمَا يَكْرَهُ, right? The Prophet ﷺ says, the definition of ghiba is to mention your brother in a manner that he would dislike. So what's saying it to their face got to do with it? Right? What does that definition entail? That definition entails that even though you might be willing and be brave enough and courageous enough to say it to their face, if it is something that they would dislike you saying to their face, and now you're saying it behind their back, then it's ghiba. Right? That justification is nonsense. Do you understand? It's just some nonsense we came up with, but it's become so common. I'll say it to his face. Your bravery has nothing to do with it. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter whether you're a wimp or you're not. The point is, you may never say it to his face. You're saying it behind his back. Despite your bravery, you're being a coward. A brave man's cowardice is still cowardice, number one. Number two, that's also irrelevant because it's backbiting. All right. And it carries all of the sin and all the darkness that backbiting carries. So it's really important that we're both very cautious about backbiting, but also we're very intolerant of it. So when people do it in front of us, we shouldn't tolerate it. We shouldn't accept it. Right? We shouldn't accept it and we shouldn't tolerate it. And this goes back down to, this is a very, very good place to revisit that whole conversation about mudara, where that which was contrasted with mudahana, right? And al-muhasibi basically talks about this in one of the previous sessions. He says mudara is when you tolerate people by being gentle to them, by being nice and gentle and forbearing. Mudahana is when you remain silent despite their evil, right? You refuse to correct them in the interest of positive relations. You refuse to do nahi anil munkar or amr bil ma'ruf. You refuse to enjoin good and forbid evil, where there is clearly a context to do though and capacity to do though, meaning the conditions that I've often spoken about of enjoining good and forbidding evil are there, right? Meaning you can do it, but you don't do it out of appeasement, just to not sour relations or because you want to stay in people's good books. That is called mudahana, right? And muhasibi basically was in one of the lines, he was warning about it as a terrible thing. That when it comes to mudarat, just being gentle and compassionate and empathic and tolerant and forbearing towards people, do that as much as you can, right? Make that a quality that you have. But mudahana, absolutely avoid it, right? Ghiba is one time when a lot of mudahana is done, a lot of this kind of a lot of this tolerance out of sycophancy, right? It's a kind of, you want to suck up to the person being their good book, so you tolerate their evil. And a time when this happens a lot is when the other person is engaging in backbiting, is engaging in social ill, backbiting a person, slandering a person, both, right? That's when mudahana is there. Anyway, coming back to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, so he says backbiting is that you mention your brother in a manner that he would dislike. So a companion asked the Prophet ﷺ, the questioner asked him, what if he has what I am mentioning? What if what I am saying what I am saying about him is in him, right? Meaning it's true. What I'm saying, what I am backbiting is the truth. And the Prophet ﷺ said, he said, إن كان فيه ما تقول فقد اغتبته وإن لم تكن فيه ما تقول فقد بهته. If he has in him that which you say, then you have backbited him. Backbiting is by definition mentioning something true about a person that they would dislike. وإن لم تكن فيه ما وإن لم يكن فيه ما تقول فقد بهته. If he does not have in him what you say, meaning if it's not true, then it's slander, which is actually a capital offense in Islam if it's publicly done and witnessed, by the way. Then you've slandered the person. If you lied about the guy, then it's slander. Which is an even worse sin. It's a kind of shahadatul zur, which is one of the it's a kind of false testimony, which is one of the destructive sins. One of the destructive sins, one of the major, like the higher, what I might call the higher order sins, right? If there, you know, I just made that term up, but it's from the kaba'ir. Obviously, there's lots of kaba'ir, but this is like from the mubiqat, the destructive kaba'ir. All right, inshallah. So let's move on from the ghiba. Oh, by the way, I recently posted as well. You know, some of the ulama have clarified that that backbiting a non-Muslim is also haram, right? Especially somebody you have peaceful relationships with. Backbiting non-Muslims, for example, in the West where we live, for no reason other than, oh, you know, they're fair game because they're non-Muslims, haram, impermissible in Islam, and the fuqaha have been very, very clear about this. Because backbiting is ties in with the rationale. I'll give you the rationale. Backbiting ties in with the sanctity of people's honor, because if you and a person's honor is really about how they feel about their sense of honor. So when you attack somebody's honor, it's got nothing to do with how you feel about their honor. It's a question of how you diminish themselves, how you diminish them in terms of their standing in their own eyes. So if a person feels dishonored by you because you have indeed done something wrong, obviously if a person feels dishonored by you because you've done nothing wrong, that's different, right? Then they're making a false assumption of you and a false accusation against you. But you have done something wrong against them that has made them feel uncomfortable. It's hurt their ird, their honor, right? That's the word in Arabic. So protection of honor, of ird, of a person's dignity, is one of the maqasid of Sharia, one of the higher objectives of deen, right? And the Prophet ﷺ was once, in a hadith, he was once making tawaf of the Kaaba, and he praised the Kaaba, extolled the Kaaba, saying, "Ma a'zamaki wa ma a'zama hurmataki," how great are you, the Kaaba, and how great is your sanctity, and so on. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, "But by God, by Allah, or by the one in whom in whose hands is my soul, the sanctity of a believer is greater than your sanctity." Right? And then the Prophet ﷺ mentioned things like, I don't remember the exact things, but he mentioned blood, the sanctity of his blood, the sanctity of his honor, and that وَأَلَّا يُظَنَّ بِهِ إِلَّا خَيْرٍ, as he mentions that as well, that only good is thought of him, that he is not looked at with suspicion, and that people do not have bad opinions of him. This is all part of the sanctity of a believer, and it's based on these things that we understand the sanctity of one's honor and dignity. And because backbiting goes back to that maqsad, goes back to that objective of Sharia, one of those great sacred protected things in Sharia, that all of those protections are also afforded to people who are at peace with Muslims. So the dhimmi and the mu'ahid. So for example, in the olden days, the terminology the fuqaha would use would be somebody who lives as a dhimmi or a citizen, let's just say, right? Like a citizen, a non-Muslim citizen in a Muslim state under the protection of the Muslim state, or somebody who is a mu'ahid, who is an ally or is in peacetime with Muslims. So there is an understanding, right? Now, both of those groups of people enjoy protection of their religion, of their blood, of their honor. They enjoy those protections as well. Does that make sense? And ghiba of somebody whose honor and dignity is protected is haram, and therefore the backbiting of someone who is a non-Muslim, who, you know, in the olden days they would say somebody who is at war with the Muslims is an exception, right? You know, but the non-Muslims that we encounter, we're not at war with, so therefore it would be haram to backbite them. It's a really, really interesting and important clarification, by the way. And another thing then is to say, okay, are there any exceptions? And there are, and I should mention them before we move on from this topic, right? And that is that somebody somebody whose evil is public, somebody whose evil needs to be warned against, right? So that people are aware of their evil. It could be somebody who has clearly deviant views. All right. I'm smiling because I just discussed this with one of you on the Telegram group, right? Or I'm in the middle of discussing this with one of you on the Telegram group. And if anybody wants to join it, they can join the Telegram group as well. But clearly deviant views, not deviant views in our opinion. How do you determine that? Well, nowadays, a rule of thumb would be that generally scholars, ulama, you know, kind of particularly not, and I would caution that you establish the deviance of people based on the opinions of ulama of a group, right? I would say that you should establish that people who you should be particularly wary of are people who are seen as deviant across the spectrum, right? And obviously I always speak within the confines of Sunni Islam. So if now somebody is, the Deobandis see them as, you know, all the subgroups, right? You know, as you know, as tedious as it is to talk about our subgroups and denominations, but they are, you know, they are there. They're a reality. So we have to acknowledge them. So so let's say, you know, I'm in the UK. I suppose most of the West is the same, right? So the big subgroups in the UK, I think the biggest by number, by population in the UK is are the Brelwis. I think they have the largest numbers in terms of people, in terms of individuals who directly or indirectly affiliate. A lot of people don't directly affiliate to anything. They don't know, but they indirectly affiliate because that's their masjid. Those are the scholars they follow. That's their family, and taqlidan, basically by way of association or following, blind following. That's who they are. So in that sense, basically, there is, you know, the largest single sub-denomination of the Muslim community in the UK is the Brelwis. Then it's probably the Deobandis as a sub-denomination with the degree of rivalry against the Deobandis. And then you've got others. I would say probably one of the most prominent are the kind of Ikhwani Jamaat Islami type group. After that, you know, then probably the Salafis. Then the Sufis are a big block because of the fact that the Brelwis are Sufi, the Deobandis are Sufi. There are many Ikhwani, Jamaat Islami types who would also consider themselves to be Sufi. So that's why the, you know, Sufis, Tablighis, people like that, I don't consider them like movements. I don't consider, or things that are to do with particular particular movements or particular modes of behavior, right? Yeah, let's use the word movement for now. So things that are movements, generally, I wouldn't say are sub-denominations because they tend to cross barriers. So, for example, you'll find Tablighis who are Salafi, Ikhwani, but they're also Salafi and they're also Ikhwani and they're also Sufi. They're also Sufi. They're also etc. Right? So meaning that like it crosses those boundaries. You'll find Ikhwanis who are who also are many of the other labels and so on. So I'm talking about the kind of, I'm really talking about some of the things that really separate people out. Apologies for that. Now, so I mentioned in this country, in the UK, so most of the West is the same. This is a bit of a tangent, but this is useful since it's come to my mind, right? So you got the Deobandis, you got the Sufis, sorry, you got the Deobandis, you got the Brelwis, you got the Ikhwani, Jamaat Islami type kind of political movement, which actually is more movement orientated, right? Then you've got the Tablighis are something of a broader, like there's a massive overlap between Tablighis and Deobandis because the majority of Tablighis tend to be Deobandi, right? Not all, but so you get Tablighis from all sorts. But it is because its founder is a graduate of Darul Deoband and was a Deobandi, and so are its major leaders and so on, and have been in the past. So, and I mentioned that the Sufis are similarly a kind of spiritual movement, a spiritual path, a suluk, as they say, and it transcends all of these boundaries. But these are affiliations within the Muslim community, right? If you see that somebody is deviant kind of across the board or is regarded as deviant or questionable or problematic across the board by ulama who affiliate with all of these different groups, right? The Brelwis consider them to be problematic, the Deobandis consider them to be problematic, the Salafis consider them to be problematic, and among them, those who are Sufi consider them to be problematic, those who are Tablighi consider them to be problematic, etc., 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 meaning across the board, across ethnicities, across the Bangladeshis as a large group, ulama who are Bangladeshi as a large group, or Pakistani as a large group, or Indian as a large group, or Arab as a large, all these different identifiers, irrespective of them, somebody is looked at by the ulama among those people, not the lay people, right? But the ulama among all of these different groups and denominations and ethnicities and backgrounds, then you're probably talking about a seriously problematic person, right? But if the Deobandis consider somebody, if the Deobandis purely kind of focus on considering somebody else from one of these groups perhaps to be deviant, but they're defended by their own group and other groups, that's just polemics, man. That's just polemics. Okay. So now, somebody who like that, who generally is being regarded as being criticized or regarded as deviant and so on, and you get asked about that person, what do you think of so and so? Can you backbite that person? Naturally, if you turn around and say, yeah, that person, most of them, I think, are deviant, and you should avoid them, you shouldn't listen to them, you shouldn't trust them, etc., etc. So all things that person would dislike you saying about them. The answer to that is, yeah, I mean, you can backbite them, right? Because of that. Another person is a fasiq, fajir, drug dealer, criminal, I don't know, burglar, robber. Obviously, these are obvious people who you can backbite because people need to know. Obviously, you have to know for sure. You can't be based on the other evils that we're about to talk about, which is suspicions and bad opinions and innuendo and nonsense like that, right? That then falls into the slander category. I'm talking about, for sure, right? This is going on. The police are after this person, etc., etc. There's some harm, clear harm, that a person has to be protected from. Then, yeah, backbiting in that situation is permissible. As in the olden days, like for example, the first group of people who a person who is clearly deviant, because generally ulama consider them to be deviant, that to be the case. Somebody's asking, you can backbite them. This is exactly the kind of backbiting that the ulama allowed when they criticize hadith narrators and labeled them as liars or fabricators, right? And so on. And sometimes they wrote really bad things and negative things in the context of hadith transmission against people who are otherwise actually good people, but they were really, really unreliable, you know, slack, etc. But they were people of tahajjud, perhaps people of piety, and so on, right? But still, in the context of protecting the deen and preserving hadith and preserving the tradition, that was tolerated backbiting. Another one that ulama mentioned is if somebody comes to you for information about a person that they're considering in marriage, or you know, or their family members come to you, then you have to be honest about that person, and there is no backbiting there, right? It's obligatory upon you to be honest. You know, and finally, in the context of non-Muslims who clearly do harm, known harm, who do known harm to Muslims, those are exemptions from the prohibition of backbiting. So I thought I'd mention those. Those are the ones that come to my mind off the top of my head, inshallah. All right. So is that okay? Any questions on that? I'm going to move on from Ghiba now. All right. Okay. So where am I? وافتح باب حسن الظن بسعة التأويل. No, sorry. And سد على نفسك باب سوء الظن بخوف المسألة. Fearing the fact that you're going to be questioned on the day of judgment about this, close the door upon your nafs of suspicion and having bad opinions of other people. That's self-explanatory, right? But the thing about bad opinion is that people think it's clever. Oh, you know, like I can figure people out and so on. And for people, and some people are naturally suspicious. They have a suspicious nature, and other people are what many would say are gullible or naive, right? So how do you balance it out? Well, you balance it out by evidence, right? When it comes to having a bad opinion, well, if you have a bad feeling about somebody because of gut instinct, then you need to keep it to yourself, right? So bad opinion of another person, or you know, husnul dhan or su'ul dhan, as we say, is quite personal to start with. It's about how you feel about another person based on what you've witnessed about them. So it's not about gut instinct. It's not about personality clash, or you just, you know, I get the wrong vibes and the right vibes, you know, all that stuff, right? That often get talked about in social circles. This is all nonsense. Meaning none of that means anything, right? And you can't, you know, that guy gives me the creeps, for example, is often a statement. Well, what does that mean? And what's that about? And so on. So we have to be careful about these kind of things. Conversely, the Prophet ﷺ, you know, or rather, you know, Imam al-Muhasibi here, this is based on the Sunnah, of course, is enjoining making positive interpretations about people, and through that having a good opinion of them. What does that mean? That means that you've seen them do something, and that could, you know, you might end up having a bad opinion of the person if you were to interpret it badly, meaning if you were to interpret and assume, oh, that guy gives me the creeps, or, you know, I have a bad feeling about that person or whatever, then at least at the level of forming an opinion about the person, right, you have to have a good opinion and try to interpret. There is a difference here, similar to the ghiba case, where the vibe you're getting or the suspicion you have of a person is one of harm, right? It's one of harm. Then, you know, if it's pure speculation and opinion, you shouldn't, right? You should try and have a positive opinion of them. But if it has any inkling of evidence and it's to do with harm, definitely in that situation, you know, one should be wary and one should be concerned and so on. But if it is to do with personal sin, not wider harm, but to do with personal sin, you saw somebody talking to a woman or a woman talking to a man, and you assume what's going on here. I know that person is married, right? That's really a question of private sin, right? And you have no idea what's going on. It's just two people talking to one another. You can't have a bad opinion of that person, right? You have to assume the best and move on. It could be their sister, it could be a colleague, it could be somebody who's asking for directions, etc., etc., etc. Right? Oh, but they were smiling, etc. Well, maybe they're just being nice, right? Maybe they're just conforming to the social norms of this country, of the West, right? And so on, and so on, because these things have become instinctive for us. Like, I can't, if I'm talking to somebody, I can't not smile. It's just not possible. It's just, it's really difficult to see something like that off. And if somebody turned around and thought, oh, look at that, right? He's all smiley with that person, or with, in the case of a guy, with a woman, and so on, and he's married with kids. That's a disgusting way to look at people, right? So that's exactly what is prohibited. And this is exactly what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibits in the Quran. And this is where suspicions and having a bad opinion of people become a sin. Not all of it is a sin. The Quran says, "Inna ba'da dhanni ithm," that often some instances of suspicion and having a bad opinion of people are sinful, because others are warranted, and you have to, that your justification has to be rock solid, right? For kind of going along with a suspicion about a person. Does that make sense? So that's extremely important. If you're a policeman or somebody, you're an investigator of some kind, etc., then it's your job to investigate, right? That's different, because you're trying to get to the truth. But you're just a normal person, right? But you have all these weird opinions of people, and you generally kind of have a negative opinion of people, and so on and so forth. You need to work on that. That's a problem. Okay, inshallah. And then he talks about, I think I've elaborated those enough. I want to move on to this point where he says, and purify your remembrance of Allah from associating undesirable or reprehensible things to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What that basically means is, when we think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we should only think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based upon the requirements of adab, based upon the requirements of good etiquette towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and never attribute anything reprehensible to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the example that ulama often use for this, the Prophet ﷺ, for example, according to one hadith in his thana, when he, in the iftitah of salah, when he began salah after the takbir tahrima, one of the du'as he would recite is labbaika wa sa'adayk wal khayru kulluhu biyadayk. I'm here, your Lord. I'm here, O Lord. All good is in your hand. Wa sharru laysa ilayk. And evil is not attributed to you. What does that mean? Does that mean Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has nothing to do with evil, or evil doesn't happen with his permission? Evil has a life of its own. Allah's power does not govern it or control it, or that Allah didn't create it? Does it mean any of that? No. It means that I am your slave. You are my master, my Lord, my creator. You control my affairs. I want your pleasure. I want salvation from you in the hereafter. These things are not attributed to you. I will refrain from attributing those things to you. Does that make sense? So that's why ulama often say that, for example, when we mention Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we will say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Lord of the heavens, the Lord of the earth, the Lord of people, the Lord of the angels, the Lord of the prophets, and the Lord of saints, and so on. But we won't refer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with negative truthful statements, like oh, God is the Lord of monkeys and pigs, or God is the Lord of criminals and murderers. He's the Lord of everybody. So those things are true, but he cannot be referred to in those ways, because that goes against the principle of referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by way of tanzih, by always referring to him positively, referring to him through praise, referring to him through veneration, and referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with etiquette and adab. I mean, that kind of goes without saying, but it's quite easy for people to end up losing sight of that. Okay, inshallah. So that's what's meant here. And then Imam Muhasibi talks about taking advantage of time and taking account of our time and knowing what takes away our night and our day from us. Here, Shaykh Abdul Fattah Bughudda has a really kind of lengthy commentary on this. And I want to share, in the last 3 minutes, I want to share one example of it, right? We have a bit of time today. I want to share one example of it because it's really fascinating, right? He says, اكتسب الأوقات ولا. This is Shaykh Abdul Fattah's commentary, right? So he says, take account and earn from your times, and don't waste them without filling them up with something that is either seeking of benefit or giving of benefit, either by an activity that is going to benefit you in some positive way and give benefit in some way. And yes, that part of that can be leisure. By the way, I'm not going to elaborate on this, but let me throw that in. Part of that can be leisure, part of that can be relaxation, part of that can be rest, part of that is playfulness with one's spouse, with one's family, and so on and so forth. All right. And it has to be on balance, you know, and so on. Everything has its place. You know, the lion's share of your free time, of your social time, should be for your family and for your relatives, and then for your friends, and so on, right? And there should be balance in all of this. And there are problems. For example, if 90% of your free time is with your friends, hardly any of it is with your family, and none of it is for your relatives, for example, you give no time to your parents. So there's a hierarchy, there's an order of things, and you know, there's a problem if all of your time, all of your free time is spent in leisure. When I say free time, I mean time that you could spend in a variety of ways, including benefiting your deen, including worship, including dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reading, studying, all of those things, all of that time. You spend 90% of it playing computer games, watching movies, watching television series, binging on box sets, or don't call them box sets anymore, do they? Netflix series, yeah? You know, stuff like that. And obviously there are some really nasty examples of what people do with their time, you know, including some really crazy addictions and so on, right? Let's not even go there. I'm talking about things that people do without even thinking twice about them. Then you have a problem, you have a serious imbalance. Yes, we need our leisure time, we need our relaxation time and so on, but we should find a way to spend the lion's share of our time in a way that benefits people, benefits us, and so on. And then Shaykh al-Fattah says, وَخَاصَةً إِذَا كُنْتَ طَالِبَ عِلْمٍ. This is particularly true if you're a student of knowledge, meaning there is now a greater kind of emphasis upon the way you spend your time. And by student of knowledge here, we're talking about scholars, imams, you know, and students of knowledge, that whole kind of class of people, and that basically means everybody, because either you're a scholar, like a proper scholar, as in, you know, you're a person of speciality in an area of knowledge, you write, you etc, basically what I'm not, or you're a preacher type of person who people rely on for their religious guidance, etc. You know, you teach the deen, you're kind of that kind of position, you're recognized for that, you've studied, you have a background in it, and so on, like people like me. And then you have people who are formally studying towards that for their own benefit, or perhaps aspiring to benefit the community and benefit the ummah, or people who are studying for themselves. People who are studying deen for themselves is everybody. So Shaykh al-Fattah is talking about student of knowledge, but more with people, and then the examples he gives shows that he's talking about people who are really dedicated to it, right? Like in terms of, you know, specializing and really pursuing it. But actually the term student of knowledge covers everybody, because talabul ilmi faridatun ala kulli muslimin wa muslima, because seeking knowledge is obligatory upon every single Muslim, man or woman. And therefore I would say all of you think of this as talking about yourself, not not allamas and scholars and so on, right? But yourself. And this is a really extreme example, but a really fascinating one. So, but you know, we can take inspiration from it. So anyway, before I get onto the example, he says, فالوقت هو رأس مالك ولقد كان مؤخر بغداد محدثها الخطيب البغدادي يمشي وفي يده جزء يطالعه. He says your greatest asset is time, and the great historian of Baghdad and the muhaddith of Baghdad, al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, rahmatullah alayhi, famous scholar, he used to walk with a volume in his hands that he's reading. When he used to walk, he used to be reading something. Kind of nerdy, right? But that's our ulama, right? And he used to do that kasban lil waqti hatta fi athna al mashi, so that he could earn something beneficial from his time, even when he's walking. And this is mentioned in his biography in Imam al-Dhahabi's Tadhkiratul Huffaz. But the reason why I wanted to read this was because there's something really fascinating that something kind of occurred to me there when I was reading about Khatib al-Baghdadi rahmatullahi alayhi, his habit of reading a book while he's walking. That although it might kind of sound strange to us, we might think, oh, you know, that's so nerdy, right? I mean, kids who do that get picked at school, right? My son used to like reading during playtime, and he used to complain of being bullied for it. Right, you know, he used to read a book, you know, and that's what he used to enjoy at the time, right, in secondary school, and he used to get bullied for it, and he kind of had to get into a few squabbles and earn his respect the hard way. Sadly, that's social life in schools, right? And this is in an Islamic school, right? Can you imagine if you did that, I don't know, in a mainstream school, right? But in an Islamic school. And I later found out that his way of dealing with all of that was to not stop what he's doing. He insisted that I'm going to do what I want to do, but I'm not going to let you mess with me. And he earned his respect by getting into fights and squabbles, unfortunately. I found out, to my horror, later on. But anyway, but you get my point about how society looks at these things, right? You know, people are like, hang on. But doesn't society now think it's completely acceptable to walk around with your eyes glued to a mobile phone screen? Funny, isn't it? I mean, what are you doing on a mobile phone while you're walking? You're not watching a movie. If you are, you're totally messed up. But most likely you're catching up on what you're reading, right? Everybody's looking at phones. But the funny thing is that that's all looked at negatively by everyone. But it also presents an amazing opportunity. You might not be able to carry volumes of books with you all the time, but you can carry whole libraries on your phone. And you can be reading all the time, making use of your time. But we don't do it. Like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us this double-edged sword, but it's taken all excuses off the table. You can be reading Quran on your phone, you can be reading books on your phone, etc., etc. You know, now, to be honest, because of this flexibility, the majority of the books that I tend to read, I tend to always look for a digital version of it so that I have to carry the book with me so that I can read it wherever. Right? And I struggle for free time, so I try to make the most out of moments when I can read, and I use my phone, which is why I tend to use a large screen phone. It's one of the reasons why, you know, I forked out the money for a big phone with a pen so that I can read and I can annotate. Right? So it's really interesting how actually in an age of distractions, there's an interesting kind of flip side to it, which is that it's not so difficult to actually follow the examples of these amazing people of the past, because everything's been made easier for us, including spending our time in beneficial ways. Anyway, I do say to my students, though, if you attend my lessons, then don't watch my lessons on a mobile phone, because of the fact that you're going to be distracted. You know, it's like you're in the middle of listening to something really, really important, like listening to this now, and then suddenly, or whatever, something goes off, and it's a WhatsApp alert, and off you go. So I usually tell people, no, use your laptops. because of the alerts, you know, or at least turn all of that off somehow. I don't know how you do that. I can't seem to be able to turn it off. Anyway, and another really, really interesting one is, if you don't mind, 2 minutes, right? Straight up from a straight translation, right? So he says, in the seerah, or in the biography of the Imam Abu al-Wafa ibn Aqil al-Hanbali, so a great senior kind of major Hanbali scholar called Abu al-Wafa ibn Aqil rahmatullahi alayhi, well known. I think scholars will know him very well. Born 431 Hijri, right? Passed away 513. One of the greats kind of in Islam. He says, this is really interesting. He says, I don't permit myself to waste a moment from my life, right? And so that when my tongue stops discussing knowledge and debating knowledge, and my eyes have stopped looking at knowledge, meaning reading, I start to engage my mind at my time of rest. So even when he's resting, he doesn't like to switch off from knowledge. And because I'm not engaged in kind of in actual beneficial activity, at that time I find that I'm down, right? When I'm searching for some kind of beneficial engagement. But but he's engaging his mind to try to find something beneficial. And then he says, I don't, فَلَا أَنْهَضُ إِلَّا وَقَدْ خَطَرَ لِمَا أَسْطُرُهُ. He goes, in those idle moments, I tend to search, and I don't get up until I have found something that I'm going to write about. And then he goes and writes. And Ibn Aqil is very his example is really interesting, because he was somebody who's famous for production. He always felt that he needed to write things down. And there's a fascinating story about his achievements in that regard. It's also a bit double-edged, because there's a kind of tragic element to it as well. وإني لأجد من حرصي على العلم وأنا في عشر الثمانين أشد مما كنت أجده وأنا ابن 20 سنة. He says I find that my desire, and this is something honestly, when I read, every time I read this line about him, I'm like, oh, Allah, please let that be so for me as well. He says, I find my passion and my desire for knowledge, now that I'm in my 80th year, right? Now that I'm in my 80s, in today's language would say, now that I'm in my 80s, to be stronger than how I found it to be when I was in my 20s. All right. Anyway, in a nutshell, right, this habit of Imam Aqil kind of constantly getting to a point where he's found a fa'idah. He used to find a fa'idah, and then he used to write it down. Something beneficial, he used to write it down, right? He is attributed to have written a book called Kitab al-Funun, the Book of Sciences. And Imam al-Dhahabi says that a book of this size has not been written in the world, right? And he says someone who found a particular volume of it, actually found a specific volume of it, told me, Imam al-Dhahabi is saying this, he's saying somebody who found a specific volume of this book said that he found a volume that was numbered after 400, that it was actually the 400 and something volume, right? Meaning that's an indication to Imam Dhahabi, that's an evidential indication to Imam Dhahabi of how big that book was and how much Imam Ibn Aqil wrote. And those who speculate about it say that his actual achievement, that discipline actually produced 800 volumes of just of Kitab al-Funun, which didn't survive. There's references to it, people mention it in history. Sadly, that is the case for a massive chunk of Islamic authorship. But that's what happens when you're disciplined. I mean, that's just mad. I mean, that is crazy. 800 volumes. Subhanallah. I mean, that's like not, I mean, that no wonder when he talks about how he took account of his time, you have to be like that to produce. And that's something that hasn't survived, by the way. What has survived of Ibn Aqil is phenomenal. That's why he's considered one of the greats. because a phenomenal amount of his work has survived. Yeah, subhanallah. Anyway, so take advantage of your time, at least aspire to it and work towards it and be disciplined. Okay. I'm going to take a couple of questions because they're here. Obviously, if you have to go, you can go, inshallah ta'ala. With marriage information, should we only give information to the degree they ask and not overstep that boundary, especially if they have changed? Or do we have to mention all their past if they ask about it? Well, yes, but you need to mention things that are relevant. All right. So usually, if my daughter was getting married, or if I was, considering somebody for my son, obviously I wouldn't like my son to be finding out stuff about the girl by dating her. All right. I wouldn't be happy with that. That's not how we do things. That's not how our society functions. That's not how our culture works. So normally what would happen is my son would perhaps, develop an interest, hopefully in a way that would be acceptable to me. And he would come to me, or I would propose a girl to him because I've done something along the lines of, usually what would happen if somebody would say, there's a girl for your son, I think she'd be perfect. Why don't you check? Why don't you go and why don't you find out some more? Or would you like me to? And then you go and do some digging, right? And I come to you and I ask you, you know me, you know my son, this is who he is, my son's da, 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 da. Do you think this girl would be compatible? Is there anything I should be concerned about? Generally, that's how I would ask the question. I wouldn't say, is she pious? Has she ever committed zina? Has she ever done this? That's not how I would put it. That's not how it works. If anybody did, that would be silly, be weird, right? You would say, I'm considering, this is my son. How well do you know this person? Oh, I know them really well. They're X, Y, and Z. Grew up with them. My children played with them. Whatever it is, right? They're even perhaps your relative, perhaps you're related. And I ask you in confidence, right? And I say, is there anything I should be concerned about, right? Considering my son's background, is there anything that that I should be that may make them incompatible with my son or unsuitable, or that I would find problematic and concerning? Here you have a duty to be honest with me, because what's the implication of you hiding information? You hiding information is putting my son's life in jeopardy, my whole family in jeopardy, right? If you know something that's really, really, really troublesome. Of course, we're not talking, I don't want your opinion and your innuendo and your backbiting and your bad opinions, as we talked about today. I don't want none of that. I want facts. I want to know if you know something that is a matter of concern. If you don't know, then you don't know, but it has to be something that you know. Does that make sense? All right, inshallah. Okay, so the tragic side of what I mentioned about Ibn Aqil's Kitab al-Funun is that it hasn't survived. We don't have Kitab al-Funun. It never survived, like many other things. And another brother or sister is asking, the author of Kitab al-Funun, how did he keep his ilm that sharp without forgetting? Well, one way why is obvious. He was one of those people that always wrote things down. He wrote everything down. Another thing about traditional scholarship is that there is this over celebration of them having photographic memories, etc., which I'm sure many of them had, and they had phenomenal memories, and they had very little distractions, and they were very dedicated, as you've seen. But one thing that they did, particularly of their key works and their key contributions, particularly with regards to hadith collection, is that they revised. They used to revise. And people that were known for memory, people that were known for imparting knowledge from memory, didn't remember things because they just never forgot, but remembered things because they revised, right? And this is well established in the tradition, well recorded about them. Okay, another question. If your son had a background, for example, and your son hides it, he had previous relationships, does he have to admit his potentials to his potential spouse? If she asks, yes, I would say yes, right? I've come across scenarios where two people come together and they're like, I have a past. And the girl admits you have a past. And they both choose to not talk about it further, that we've made our tawbah from it. We know that's the case. And we're happy to move on in spite of that. And sometimes people talk about it and still move on or don't move on, right? But in my opinion, you know, it's a tragedy for a pious boy or girl who's clean and chaste and pious, you know, is deprived of having a boy or girl that is of their compatibility in terms of religiosity, in terms of background, in terms of chastity, and so on, because another person willfully lied about their background just to marry them. It's a heinous thing to do. So yeah. Oh, but how am I going to get married? Don't commit sins. Don't, you know, most people are forgiving of sinfulness, by the way. Most people are forgiving of sins that are to do with, you know, oh, I missed the odd salah, sometimes I struggle to get off fajr, or, you know, etc., etc. People are forgiving of those things. But when it comes to things that are to do with violations of, you know, some of the key aspects of Islam, like prohibition of zina and things like that, people want to know these things because it's connected to marriage, because it says something about a person's, and this is something that Muslims tend to hold extremely, you know, as a matter of high value. Now, it may well be that that a person is honest about themselves, and it is precisely that honesty that results in a person forgoing it and saying, you know what, I don't mind, I like your honesty, and therefore, you know, I won't judge you for it. And so there's two bits of advice, isn't it? One is to balance things out. One is the need for honesty on the one hand, and the other is the need for forgiveness on the other hand, and the need for forbearance and forgiveness, or the need to kind of ignore a person's past after they have made tawbah. So for example, you're considering somebody in marriage and they have a past and they admit to it. Every single Sahabi of the Prophet ﷺ had a past. They're all people that had that came into Islam from Jahiliyyah. So what happened? Like, they were held to that for the rest of their lives, or they were forgiven? What happened? So this is the point, isn't it? It's the lie that's the problem. We can establish a society on both sets of values, or honesty on the one hand and tolerance on the other hand, right? And forbearance and forgiveness on the other hand. A person has made tawbah, something in they did stuff in their distant past, and they admit to it. What we're supposed to see is their tawbah, not their past. So there are two sets of values here. One balances out the other, right? So that's important. I think that's the way I would see it. You've heard muftis saying you don't need to admit, you know, etc. Yeah, but I'm not talking about fatwa, am I? I'm not giving a fatwa here. I'm talking about what is advisable to do. I'm talking about values, right? Are you obligated shar'an to mention it if you haven't been asked? Perhaps not. Okay. Does that mean that, like, why would you hide something that the person would find out anyway? That doesn't make any sense, does it? Like, it's known out there, and you're like, oh no, you know, I'm a wonderful person, I don't have any background. No, you might not say that, but it may be that it was never asked. But obviously, it's smart to kind of mention stuff if the whole community knows about it, if it's a public information. If it is something that is so personal that nobody knows about it, yeah, then it's different, and you've not been asked about it, you know, then over here, that would fall under what we call satr, conceding private sins, so as to really, it's a form of kind of guarding society from overexposure to sins and sinfulness. If something is really, really private, then yes, you know, you kind of hide it. But if it is, if it's public, or if it's been asked, and if it's relevant to the context, like relevant to the question of marriage, then I would say that it is advisable to admit it. And if you're talking to a good person, chances are they will see who you are now. All right, inshallah. Okay. Wow, you guys are like lots of questions today. Okay, so another one. Last question here, right, guys? So how important is family when it comes to marriage? If the families are very different in terms of practice, social standing, and tradition, should we avoid looking into a potential who may seem suitable or that they show interest? You know what? I don't want to compromise anybody's situation by giving obvious. So let's do the caveats first. Obviously, it depends, and every individual is different, and so on. As rules of thumb, general rules of thumb, yeah, family matters a lot because they get in the way, right? They're a massive, they're a massive problem as well as a massive asset, right? So, for example, families are different in terms of practice, social standing, and tradition. Yeah, I mean, if you're a girl getting married into a family who has a completely different background, then technically, but according to Shari'i guidance, right, there's a compatibility issue here, particularly if it's a question of religiosity. And ulama have written that a religious girl is not compatible to a non-religious boy. And sometimes the families are also an issue because if the boy is religious but the family isn't, but the family is clearly in his life, there are some practical questions here, right? Forget the technical consideration about compatibility, right? There are some practical issues here. You have to ask yourself, how is that going to impact your life? So, and that's where it becomes, you can now go into the domain of considering each scenario in each case. My point is, generally families matter. There can be exceptions. Those exceptions would be based on considering the details of the situation. Also, if my family want to consider a potential despite the apparent difference in the family dynamic, should we go ahead or not? I would say if your family are encouraging it, you should look into it properly and see if it's something where you can apply what I said about the exception. The norm remains. The fact that you have to be wary of this, that remains as advisable. And now you have to consider, can I make an exception here? What is advisable is clear. Can I make an exception? And that requires you to look into things. Can't just take the leap when actually all of the evidence suggests there could be problems here. You understand? If all of the boxes are ticked, then for you to say no, you need to find a reason to say no. That's going to be exceptional. If all of the boxes are pointing towards problems and then you still want to go ahead, then you also are going ahead on an exceptional basis. You need to find the reason for that exception. That's basic common sense, right? I mean, you can meet and stuff, but that's if you are interested in finding it more. But I would warn people about meeting others to see if something clicks. This idea of clicking, I find it just, to me, it comes across like fluff. It's part and parcel of the fluffiness of modern society. I want to see if something clicks. What in God's name does that mean? What clicks? What, you're able to have a conversation? You may or may not be able to have a conversation with anybody, right? We had a great conversation. What does that mean? Your life's going to be about great conversations. Oh, we can have great conversations and therefore we're going to be happy. It's stupid, honestly, right? It's more. You need to know a lot about people's background, their upbringing, what kind of person they are, what they valued. Most importantly, their values are extremely important. You value deen. Do they value deen? You value studying the deen. Do they value studying the deen? You want a career. Do they want you to have a career? You know, these things are really, really important. You have to work all of that stuff out, right? It's not just about, clicking and, and, oh, I want to see if I'm attracted, etc., etc. Yes, attraction is important, but don't overplay it. Don't overplay it because of the fact that they're not going to be beautiful forever, right? I don't know, 10 years at best, 20, 15 years, 20 years, then what? I'm not attracted anymore, so I'm going to leave. Because that's what people do in modern society. Not attracted, a husband and wife are having an argument and something is going on and, oh, are you not attracted to me anymore? What kind of nonsense is that? Like, again, what does that mean? So if like, clearly there has to be some attraction for a couple to get married, but to what extent? Like the image of some Hollywood star, is that the standard, or is it that oh, this is an attractive person to me and that's enough, right? Because they're not going to be like that forever. Somebody who's clean shaven today might decide to grow a beard. Somebody who's, who has a nice, clean black beard today is going to go gray soon. They're going to look different, right? Somebody's skinny today might get fat tomorrow, right? Fat today might become skinny tomorrow. These are all, you have to. There needs to be some element of nuance and give and take and so on. Basically, just keep the superficial stuff. It's necessary but somewhat muted, and part of that also requires working on yourself, because if that's all you care about, there's a big chance you're headed towards disaster anyway. Allah forbid it, Allah protect you. Doesn't always happen, but the signals, the alarm bells are there. Basically, when elders arrange a meeting, can they arrange without permission of either of the potentials? How are they going to do that? How are they going to do it without your permission? As in, they do it and then they tell you, all right, you have to attend this. Okay, no, they shouldn't do that. Should you attend? That depends on your relationship with your elders. If things are going to get soured, what's wrong with the meeting? Go ahead and do it. But no, meaning you're asking me as not one of the elders. If an elder asked me, should we ask the youngsters their permission? Do we have to? I would say, yes, absolutely, you have to. What do you think you're doing? Right? But you asking me about should they or shouldn't they? Yes, they should, really. But the bigger question is, what should you do? I would say go along with it, check it out. That doesn't mean you're getting married, right? And yeah, so barakallahu feekum. Okay, so I'm done with the answers. Jazakumullahu khair. Let's okay, guys, I have to stop. All right, there's another question as well, but I'll ask me next week. A reason for you to attend next week, inshallah. Look, guys, somebody said, can they reach out to me for advice privately and so on? Yes, you can. So 2 ways. One, join the Telegram group. It's public, and then reach out from there, and I'll get back to you. So just go to Telegram, Mawarid Lifestyle. You'll find the public group. And secondly, you can just email Mawarid Lifestyle either through the contact form on the website under services, or it's info@mawaridlifestyle.com. All right, inshallah ta'ala. Ramadan is here. It's just around the corner. Gosh, terrible thing for me, but I think we have another week, so we'll talk about what we're going to do in Ramadan next week, inshallah ta'ala. I really, really want people who at least listen to me and attend my sessions to benefit from Ramadan courses and things like that. So please check those out. And it's Maghrib time probably 5-10 minutes ago, but we need to get going, inshallah. Jazakumullahu khair. Lots of questions today, so I thought I'd answer as many of them as I can. Okay, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.